All right, so we are group 3. We're presenting on chapter 8, teacher freedoms.
And I'm going to go ahead and start off with talking about substantive and procedural considerations. And so this part of the text talked about 2 types of due process that teachers can go through if they were in a situation where they were going to be dismissed from their position. And so the first type that the text talked about was procedural due process, and that states that the state may not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Therefore, a teacher must be given proper notice that he or she is going to be deprived of his or her personal rights, or basically their position. And then they must be provided an opportunity to be heard in a fair manner. So basically, if a teacher were to get notified that they were going to be canceled from their position or terminated from their position, they would have the right to go to hearing for that. And then the next due process is substantive due process, and that means that the state must have a valid objective when it intends to deprive a teacher of life, liberty, or property, and the means used must be reasonably calculated to achieve its objectives. So that kind of means if they are going to cancel or terminate a teacher, you have to have proof and documentation and evidence and kind of all your ducks in a row for that to happen. And the main point that they kind of made about this section was you have to have both of those in order to move forward with a termination or cancellation of a teacher. A lot of times when a hearing gets to a court situation, there'll be one of those 2 things that are not in place. And so oftentimes it'll side in favor of the teacher. So yeah, just talking about the 14th Amendment there, that kind of covers all of that. Going on to freedom of speech. So this portion of the text kind of just went over the First Amendment and how that has been controversial to teachers kind of for a while historically, just because freedom of speech was kind of limited for teachers way back when court cases started arising, but now it's become a lot more lax, to say. So basically, teachers should be granted freedom of speech. The only stipulation is that teachers may have free speech as long as it does not create material disruption to the school district. School officials are not allowed to prohibit or penalize the teacher in any manner without showing legitimate evidence, reason, or cause for concern. One of the main points during this section of the text was that if a teacher is going to choose to exercise their freedom of speech, they need to do it from the standpoint of a citizen exercising their freedom of speech towards a community rather than a teacher exercising towards a district. And so that's where a lot of times teachers can get in trouble, or things can happen as far as termination or cancellation when that teacher is exercising more of a teacher role towards a district. So that's kind of what freedom of speech talks about there. The book did go into like a typical grievance that someone may present to an employer may not be protected under the First Amendment of freedom of speech. So an example from the text stated that an employee expressed concern in a sarcastic and unprofessional manner about policies and procedures within their district. This was sent to multiple school officials. And because this particular employee was acting as a school employee, the courts ruled in favor of the district, and so the employee was let go. And so I think just keeping in mind, and you guys can chime in on this as well, I think it gets tricky when it gets to like social media things and things that happen on social media. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but just where is that line of what's okay, what's not okay? I know in one of our webinars, when they were talking to lawyers, they talked about for a long time, it was like, don't do anything on social media as a teacher and educator. But now it's kind of like you have to be on social media and watching what you're doing. So do you guys have any examples from your districts or schools you've worked with where you've known of anyone who's gotten in trouble for freedom of speech or had that as something that occurred?
I think in our district, there's been a few instances where, yeah, actually it was like a school employee and a spouse of an administrator kind of went off on a emotional tirade about just something that had happened during the day. And it was taken down very quickly. And nothing like terminating or anything like that happened, but just a conversation about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate and who to talk to if you have frustration. So.
Right. I know something we've dealt with in our district quite a bit is more like on the parent side, expressing concerns via like social media. So I think I think our teachers have done a good job, and we usually have a training at the beginning of the year of just like, here's what's appropriate to be posting about. And when you do let those things out there, that they're going to stick with you kind of for life. So I felt like that was a good point for freedom of speech.
I don't really have any personal examples, but I think that's a great practice that you guys have, Megan, that it's that preventative, proactive piece instead of just responding when something happens. Yeah, I like that.
Well, and I think it goes back to a lot of these court cases. It really was like, what evidence did the district have of how did they prevent these things to happen, or what steps were taken when the first red flags came up? And so as you read through the court cases, it's like, okay, this district had it together, like steps A, B, and C, where this district didn't have those things in place. And so I think that's just going back to that documentation and evidence. When you get into these really unfortunate situations where you're having to like go to court and have these hearings, just making sure you have your ducks in a row, I feel like as an administrator is very important. So, all right, we can go on to speech outside the school environment. And so this kind of piggybacks off of freedom of speech. So again, teachers are afforded the First Amendment rights outside the school environment. And so this really talked about, teachers have the right to go to protests, and teachers have the right to advocate for political parties. And, there was a day and time when that wasn't really acceptable for teachers, but now it is, and it's kind of it's a basic right that's protected. And so I think, again, just being careful. The book talked a lot about you can do these things outside of school, but if you're choosing to engage in acts that are unlawful, then that's still going to hurt you in the end, because that's not representing your employment in your district how they would want it to be represented. And so it's, yes, you can be members of groups, and yes, you can do, peaceful protests and things like that. But the moment that it becomes illegal or things are happening that are illegal, that's when it kind of gets in that gray area of not being okay. So you could actually go back to that one you're just
This
on.
one? Sorry.
No,
The
you're
first
fine.
one?
I'm kind of just talking and the slides are rolling. So
Sure.
there was one court case I wanted to talk about. It was the Pickering court case. And so this case arose in Will County, Illinois. A teacher named Marvin Pickering was dismissed from his position by the Board of Education in connection with sending to the local newspaper an editorial that was critical of the school's administration and the allocation of the tax funds. Initially, Pickering was ruled against, and he was dismissed from his position because of his stance on this situation. The case then went to their circuit court and the Supreme Court of Illinois, where both of those agreed with the dismissal of him because they didn't think it was within his constitutional rights to send those things about the district. Ultimately, the case went to the US Supreme Court and they reversed his dismissal and said, actually, he has the freedom of speech and basically you need to give him his job back. And so they noted in the book how this was such a turning point for teachers because this really brought up the, okay, what's okay outside of school? What can teachers be a part of and what's not okay? So the Pickering case was very prominent for that. Okay.
Do you want the last slide now? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it. You can go for the last slide. This is again just saying, teachers, if you're gonna choose to do these outside organizations or protests or whatever you want to be a part of, that's fine. As long as you are coming at it from the perspective of a citizen and you're not coming at it as an employee of this district. I'm not an employee of Lexington Public Schools advocating for this party or that party. And so I think that was one of the biggest takeaways I had from reading this part of the text. So, all right. And I think I have academic freedom as well, don't I? So this one's kind of in a nutshell, basically, originally when teachers came about, it really was the laws kind of looked at professors, and professors have a lot more academic freedom within the classroom than what teachers have. And so it kind of just narrowed it down to the fact that as a public educator, as a public employee, government employee, you don't have just the freedom to go teach whatever you want, your views, and all the things like that. There are some areas of wiggle room, but essentially your State Department of Education and your school boards are going to decide your curriculum and the things that are happening in the classroom. So I think this can get trickier when you get into like high school classes, and the classes are a little bit more specialized. I would find it difficult. I don't teach high school, but if I were a high school teacher, I feel like I would want to be, it would be more difficult to not have those harder conversations or political view conversations or things like that. But I think it definitely comes down to, are you giving factual information or are you projecting those types of views on to your students? And so, yeah, I know. Austin, do you teach high school?
Yeah, I do. Actually, I teach. I'm certified in social studies, so I definitely understand that, especially now with the idea of race and just gender rights and equality.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough. You gotta definitely keep yourself out of your own political views, but you also gotta introduce other topics so your students can talk about other sides of issues as well. So it's a very fine line, I feel like.
Yeah, I was going to chime in there too. Prior to working with Nebraska MTSS, I was a high school ELA teacher. And I think I've mentioned before, I also taught on the same reservation that Austin's at right now. And so being like a culturally responsive teacher was so important, and making sure that you had texts that were written by people of color so that students could start to, take in those diverse viewpoints and things like that. But yeah, like you mentioned, Austin, just keeping your own personal opinions free of that. But even when you look at some of our state standards, I know they just came out with the new ELA standards, and I'm not as familiar with those, but the previous ones, there were standards about diversity and about students thinking critically. And so when you want students to think critically, I think it does get really sensitive sometimes.
Yeah.
I know that right now too, there's such a focus on like social emotional learning. And I just, at the state level, I know there's been a lot of conversations and backlash as we're trying to roll out these initiatives, knowing that we need to prioritize students' like mental health as well as our teachers' mental health. People are confusing that social emotional well-being with critical race theory. And I mean, they're really not intertwined quite like that, but there's been a lot of backlash that schools shouldn't even, touch on SEBL because of these theories that it's connected in that way, which I personally, that's kind of heartbreaking to me. I feel like we have to really focus on the well-being right
Absolutely.
now, and it's kind of sucks
Yeah.
that it's that controversial.
Absolutely.
I
I
know
think,
that. Oh, go ahead, Brandy.
sorry, I was just, our government class right now is doing their election process, their election unit, where they all get in groups and then they create a political party and they do all the things, they debate, they campaign and all of that. And I just think that it provides a really good space to teach kids how to think critically and then also be respectful of other thoughts and, you know, so I'm excited to see that unit. And I think you can introduce multiple viewpoints as long as, you know, the teacher is very much in charge of the conversation and making sure that it's being guided in a way that's respectful for everybody. So
Definitely. I agree with that. I know right now we are having a little bit of difficulty with a curriculum that we adopted. We will be adopting next year, but we're piloting this year. And just like, I guess some of the viewpoints within the curriculum were brought up within another curriculum. And so the parents were challenging that and really basically like, we want to push that curriculum out the door because we don't feel like there's some appropriate things happening in the curriculum. So I feel like that kind of ties into this as well. As we have talked to our teachers, you know, the curriculum is stating the facts. And I think sometimes some of the facts and historical information can be difficult because some of it ties back to religion a little bit, but we just relate to our teachers like you're stating the facts. It's not, I feel this way about this religion and I feel this way, or I feel, you know, and it's just teaching that this is historically what has happened in our society and in our world. So that's been kind of interesting going through that process of just hearing, you know, parents kind of get upset about curriculum and how we handle that as a district. So, okay. I kind of think that wraps up academic freedom. Yeah. Yep.
Austin, I think this is where you start.
Yep. So freedom of association. So this one's actually kind of interesting, especially with all the movements that have been going on lately. The main thing that I really wanted to highlight was that peaceful assembly. So you have the right to do a peaceful assembly, especially with everything that went on a couple summers ago with Black Lives Matter. You start looking at that. Teachers have the right to assemble. They have the right to go protest as long as it's peaceful, and they don't have that stigma on that activism that they are going to do it non-peacefully. And you see that on the second part of that also that teachers are citizens and they should have that same right to be able to protest when needed. I actually had an example about that. I was working with a female teacher that went to DC and was part of an activist group for women's rights. I'm not sure if anybody else has been part of that. Her story was very interesting when she came back, and actually the school helped fund that. I'm not sure how they were able to do that, but they were able to do that, and that actually was very interesting to me at the time. I'm not sure if anybody else has had that experience.
No, I think that's really interesting that the school was able to support her. I feel like throughout this chapter, like a really big underlying theme was, you know, separating your rights as a citizen from who you are within the district. So that's interesting that they supported that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I was gonna say the same thing. That was interesting. So I taught in Oklahoma for a little bit. And so after I taught there, the whole like teaching protest kind of went down there. I don't remember if you guys remember that, where they were like out of school for like, I don't know how long. And so I just thought that was so interesting to like see that district perspective of like those teachers doing that and then being where I'm at now and just knowing the reasons why they're doing that. But I almost want to say, and maybe one of you guys know this, but are we allowed to protest in the state of Nebraska as teachers? Or is that like a union thing where we can't do that? I thought that I read somewhere that like we aren't allowed to like hold those same, I guess, protests like what they did in Oklahoma. And I thought it had something to do with like our unions are allowed to negotiate where like their union is not allowed to negotiate. But I didn't know if you guys had heard of that before or not. So yeah, that's kind of my experience with that. I have never been a part of a protest, but it's definitely very prominent in our society today.
Interesting. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either. Sorry, I was trying to look on my iPad really quick and just do a quick Google search, but I'm not
Yeah,
certain
no.
on that.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I wanted to say that would be up to the union reps and your representatives on the union board. I'm not sure on that one completely.
Mhm.
Sorry, I'll keep moving through your slides here, Austin.
You're good. So then the next part is with association. It allows you to pick the people that you want to be with. So if I want to associate myself with a certain person, I shouldn't be punished or given that right taken away. Again, since I am a citizen, I should be given those same rights. But if you look on the next little part there, it says it's also a position as public employees that we have to look out for. With that nature of it, that's when you get that social media impact that can really cause a huge issue with that idea. That if you're posting things online that you probably shouldn't be posting, or associating yourself with groups that probably aren't the greatest, and we'll get into that on the next slide, you could see some kind of punishment. Membership abusive organizations, sorry. This is just essentially the ability to be in that organization, like I mentioned earlier. As long as it's not an unlawful activity or intended to achieve an unlawful objective, you shouldn't be punished for that idea. The next part of it talks about the punishment. Speaking of the Black Lives Matter, it's supposed to be more of a peaceful movement idea. Some people took it a little too far, and I know some teachers that I've been friends with they weren't part of it, but there was pictures of them next to individuals participating in the unlawful idea of it. I know they got spoken to about it just because of where they were and how they were associated with those pictures, but they didn't get fired for it. I'm wondering if you guys would have any say. Would you think those teachers that might have been associated with those peaceful protests that was supposed to be peaceful that turned into some riots, if they should be in some trouble or dismissal or some kind of punishment towards them?
I feel like in your example, like to me, that one sounded more like they were just in proximity to somebody in like a really large gathering that was doing something unlawful. So I feel like in that one, like you said, it was just kind of a conversation about not like just kind of you're in the wrong place at the wrong time sort of thing. Not so much they were engaging in it. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
I think I agree with that. Like when you think about, for example, like the Black Lives Matter protests, like there were peaceful Black Lives Matter protests and then there were riots. And so it's really that differentiating between, what were their intentions with that? And then, what evidence and proof do you have from that?
I think, sometimes unfortunately guilt by association. And so if those teachers were, arrested or something like that, I think that brings another element to it. If it was just there were pictures of them there, but no legal action was taken against them while they were there, I think that, there could be a difference there too.
Yeah, I think both of those are good points. And like you said, Megan, just really focusing on like what's the factual evidence instead of just kind of drawing conclusions.
Yeah,
And it's just so hard now with 21st century. Everybody's taking pictures of everybody on their phone, and you could get captured in a wrong way. But being a public
Definitely.
servant, you could get in trouble just being there.
Right. And I feel like this goes, I don't know how much it went into in this chapter. I think it was maybe a different course that I had, but just really focusing on the fact that like teachers, I guess you did talk about it at the beginning, Megan, that teachers have a right to, you know, present themselves and there needs to be due process and just kind of their side of the story a little bit too. Do you want is this the last slide on this one?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, yep, we can keep going. So next one is just political rights. So kind of going into that same idea, just knowing what you're as a teacher or public servant that is unlawful and what's lawful, and actually participating in political activities. Then the right to hold office. So this one's kind of interesting, just because, for example, you should have the right to hold some office, just being a teacher. And that first part says legally you can participate in political activities and hold public office. It's just the issue would be the timing. As long as you're not doing it during your contract hours, I think that kind of causes a lot of issues. So as you're a teacher, you need to make sure you're watching the time, and as long as you're not in the contract hours, you should be okay with doing that. But you also shouldn't be using your idea as being a teacher to get that political gain. So you shouldn't be campaigning to your during your school hours or during school functions as the teacher to your parent, to the parents of your kiddos, or to your kids in general. And then it kind of keeps going into the same one. It may be based on your school board policy. I could take leave of absence if you're not following the school guidelines, essentially, and you're holding office. That could run into that time frame of your contract hours. And it goes back to what you're signing up for as being a public servant and when you're actually supposed to be working, especially being a teacher, you're on salary. So you're projected to be on those days working. And then, teacher shouldn't be dismissed because of his or her becomes a candidate for public office. Again, same thing. You got the contract hours. As long as you're going outside those contract hours and you're not using when you're teaching or working with kids as you're being paid, there shouldn't be any issue with you running for public office.
So I'm just going to kind of build off of Austin there because this next objective really tied in to that right to hold office, and that's participation in political campaigns. So just really basic, again, that they have the right to campaign. Teachers do as well as other employees, and then understanding that their role within the district is going to transcend their role as citizens. So just keeping in mind the time commitment that that political campaign would take, making sure it doesn't have any potential conflict of interest regarding their job responsibilities and duties within the school. And then a really big thing that Austin touched on as well is just making sure that their political rights are not exercised in the name of the school district, so that it's their right as a citizen, but it's not an affiliation with what they're doing within the school, not representative of the school district either. And then this section also just kind of built on the fact that schools can't threaten, harass, or discriminate against any employee who runs for public office. And then just building on that leave of absence that Austin talked about, that in addition, they should grant leave of absence if requested by the employee based on individual merits of each case. The last thing that this section really kind of talked about was that there often are like districts are going to actually have policies and procedures in place for staff members who choose to run for office. So like personally, I didn't have any experience knowing somebody who ran for somebody that I was close to while I was in my last district that ran for a public office or was in a political campaign. So I was just going to ask, do any of you guys like have experience, either yourselves or a coworker who campaigned or held public office while working for a school district? Like what kind of position it maybe was, anything along those lines of granted leave. And then if you guys know of policies in your district, this was one I just wasn't really familiar with on a personal level.
So in Macy, I had a pair that ran for tribal council, and the school board and superintendent made sure that everybody knew you weren't supposed to be doing anything to help your campaign during school hours. And then when they did the election time, it was during school days, and they had to bring their own food, and you kind of have a pop-up tent on the way to go vote. So my parent had to take the day off, but he or she did get caught doing a kind of a political view aspect of working on the campaign during school hours. We did have to give them a strike because of the participation of the actually running for office during school hours, which was a big no-no. So
Yeah.
one of the 3 strikes was thrown on that.
I forgot there was another piece in here. I don't think I mentioned it, just that obviously employees can't use like the school equipment, the facilities or supplies for their campaign too. And so I wonder, even with that one, Austin, if it would be, you know, if they were working on it with like a school laptop or something, that would be,
Yep.
you know, school
They
equipment
definitely were.
also. Yeah.
Yeah, they got caught on camera with it, and I think just because of being on the tribe, they weren't going to dismiss them, but they definitely did get a strike for it, which get enough of those and you end up getting dismissed.
Mhm.
At my previous district, we had a teacher that was a school board member for the district that he lived in. And then he taught in our district. And that was an interesting, like, because it was the next town over. So that was an interesting dynamic, because we were trying to kind of co-op at the time with sports and all of that. And I think sometimes there were some times that he kind of had to be talked to about, like, okay, are you talking as a school board member, or are you talking as an employee? And so I think it's hard to draw that line sometimes.
That would be a really difficult one. I could see where like opinions definitely might be biased in that situation too.
For sure.
So the next objective that I had on this one was about dress and grooming. So one thing that I found really interesting through this section was that typically the courts have sided with school districts when it comes to any disputes about, you know, teacher dress code, what they're wearing, you know, hygiene things, or like personal grooming. So typically the courts have sided with the school districts. There were 3 court cases that were mentioned in the text. One of them that us as a group we found just really interesting was, I think it was from the 60s, but it was about a high school ELA teacher who didn't wear a tie while he was teaching his English class. And so that went to court, and what they ended up, the courts upheld what the school district had said, and said that his basic rights weren't violated by them requiring that he wore a tie while he taught that class. What was interesting though, it was just when he was teaching that English class, he also taught like a filmmaking class, and it wasn't required that he had to wear it there. So we thought that one was interesting. There was a second case that they mentioned about schools forbidding like beards and the way that men wore their facial hair. The courts also upheld that that one was reasonable. The final one that I think was pretty controversial was about a teacher who was wearing African style head wraps. And for about 3 years, she continued to get warnings about them. After that 3 years, the employee was terminated, and then she filed a grievance saying that the wraps pertained to her religious belief. But what the courts ended up saying is that they upheld the district's choice to terminate her employment. And the reason that they said it didn't violate those like religious freedoms was because she didn't bring them up until the very end of the grievance process. So she didn't really make that aware at the beginning, which I thought was pretty interesting. So then what has not been settled, however, is the degree of the constitutional protection that teachers are entitled to receive during these disputes. Some other things, oops. I don't know why that went through 3 times, sorry. Okay, so some other things that I had just noticed on this one, the text said that school districts, like their argument typically is going to be that that proper dress creates that professional image, which is going to have a positive impact on students, is what school districts are typically saying. So I just went and kind of did a little bit of a Google search because I wanted to find specific research that showed correlations between teacher dress code and student performance. I know that I personally, like as a teacher, when we were granted, in the middle, we always got to wear jeans on Friday and have a little bit more casual dress, but like those additional jeans days were a way to boost staff morale. And I don't think that we were doing a poor job at teaching when we got to wear jeans or something a little bit more casual. So I know that I personally, that's kind of where my opinions laid. So when I was reading the chapter, I really wanted to see, is there evidence? Is there actually research that says there's a correlation? So what I found, I kind of found mixed opinions on that, which I kind of figured I would. There were some studies that showed that there might be a correlation, like a slight correlation to student achievement and having a positive impact. But really what it all boiled down to was a lot of perceptual data. And it's, typically about credibility. And if teachers are going to look like a credible, source of information as they're teaching. And so, like I said, it was a lot of perceptual data, like what do students think? Do students think more highly of their teachers when they're dressed in a certain way or not? And then some of the other things that they did while they were researching and actually observing some of these classrooms that I thought a lot of their sources of data points were like engagement walkthrough pieces of data. So for example, like the number of students who were attentive in the classroom, level of participation, et cetera, in classes where teachers dress more casually, and then ones where they had like a business attire type dress code. So I took that kind of a step further and I ran with it because right now through NDE, every school has to submit a targeted improvement plan for special education. And so within those targeted improvement plans, every school in the state has to select an evidence-based practice that's going to be used district-wide. And so one of those is engagement strategies. So this was a really big discussion that we had recently in like a statewide training that somebody brought up in a breakout room that I was trying to facilitate. But the question was, we know that there's engagement strategies that are research-based, but those walkthrough forms to see how many kids are attentive, how many are paying attention, it's too perceptual and what somebody perceives as they walk through that it's not actually evidence-based. So that's what I found really interesting about the research is that it's so perceptual. It's not evidence-based. How can you really know if there's a true correlation? So I was just going to kind of open, that was a really long tangent kind of, but I thought it was interesting because I wanted to know like, what's the proof that dress code is going to impact student learning? And I'm not suggesting that teachers get to wear sweatpants every single day and, not take care of themselves. That's not what I'm saying, but like a more business casual type approach. I know that some schools don't let teachers wear like colored skinny jeans. I know that was in my last district handbook. We all did, and it was never acted upon. But I know that it was in policy that they weren't supposed to. So I was just going to kind of open it up and ask like how strict your guys' policies were, and if you guys felt like there was an impact on student learning. Sorry, I rambled for a really long time.
Up until like last year, the year before at the high school, we were never allowed to wear jeans, not on Fridays, not if we paid or anything like that. And so last year we started wearing jeans once a month, like on Fridays for our I Love Public School Day or Feel the Love Fridays. If you had a t-shirt, you could wear jeans and pay donate $5 or whatever. And then this year we're just kind of like handing out jeans day like candy. I don't know. I think sometimes teachers are way more lax if they're not dressed professionally. Like, but again, that's perceptual data, right? Like I don't know. That is an interesting concept. But I think just legally, if it's what the handbook says,
right,
then you have to follow it. But at the same time, some of the handbooks haven't been updated for a very long time because I think our policy handbook still says that females have to wear knee-length skirts every day. So, just making sure. I don't know when the last time I read it. It's been a while since I read it, and I know that they've done some work on the employee handbook, but I don't know.
I mean, for me, I don't really dress up. I wear golf pants that look like dress pants, and I'd rather wear those than jeans anyways. They're easier to wear, and then just a polo. So my district isn't very cutthroat on it. We wear jeans like you're saying all the time now. It seems like this year. But I'd rather wear my golf pants and jeans anyways. They look better and they feel better, but I don't really feel a difference when I wear jeans compared to what I usually wear. So yeah, I could see the perception part of it, but
Yeah. Brandy, what you said, I was just gonna jump on with too. You had said something about like teachers, are probably going to behave a little bit more professionally when they're dressed more professionally, and then kind of your behaviors and attitude are a little more lax when you have the casual dress. So one of the things, as I was doing just outside research on the evidence, one of the things it also brought up is that when you're dressed professionally, that it creates, that credibility and then that figure of somebody that's above them and has a level of authority. So then me just, I don't know, again, that it doesn't totally resonate with me and things that I would probably prioritize as a future administrator. The thing that it brought up to me was this idea of, that sounds like an older version of education where teachers are like the sage on the stage and everybody walks in, sit down, be quiet, listen to me type of thing, instead of, making an environment that's really comfortable for students to engage in the learning process. So that was one thing I was going to bring up too. Like I used to, when I was teaching, I would always, have different kinds of vans and things like that in my shoes. I liked shoes that were similar to the shoes that my students wore. And that was just a way for us to build a relationship and rapport with the kids. And so that was, I don't know, I just kind of struggled with this concept a little bit, but.
I think it goes to like also, so like I work in a kindergarten and first grade building. So what works for us like in a kindergarten classroom is much different than like what works for a high school teacher. And I feel like that's where we haven't struggled, like we're fine, but it's also like, hey, I'm on the floor like half of the day, or I have a screaming child that I'm carrying down to the office. Like those types of things don't always happen at the high school level. So like if we're in, knee-length skirts or dress pants and heels, like that's really difficult to like connect on their level, like we're oftentimes kneeling down to have conversations or talk to them. And it's just, sometimes it doesn't fit, what we're doing, and that connection can kind of be disheveled in that.
Absolutely. So I swear this is my last tangent, but that made me think of when I was still in my teaching position, we returned after COVID. We had some teachers who were really trying to push that we could dress more casually, that our dress code wasn't enforced, I would say, as we came back from COVID, and the rationale being, number one, staff well-being and morale, that if we were able to dress more comfortably, we'd be taking care of ourselves, things like that it just might be mood boosting. The second thing that they brought up was that often your dress clothes, if it's like dry clean only, or maybe something that, is not sent through the washer and, I don't want to say like decontaminated, but like washed and cleansed as regularly as your more like comfortable clothing might be. And so they also tried to push it in that sense that it was a safety concern and like health concern to wearing the professional dress clothes all the time. So our school actually said, if that's something that concerns you, feel free to wear scrubs every day. Otherwise, we'll enforce the dress code policy. So we thought that was interesting because I'm like, scrubs in the school. I don't know if that, I don't know. I thought that was a really interesting one that came
That
up.
is funny.
All right.
There were lots of districts that said that teachers could wear scrubs. I don't know.
Oh, really? I didn't know it was a widespread thing. We thought it was kind of laughable at the time. We're like, no, I really know we will, but
yeah,
that's funny. I have not heard that.
Okay, I will let you know, Brandy.
Okay, perfect. I had right to privacy. So it's commonly held that teachers enjoy a measure of privacy in their personal lives. Obviously, they have a right to privacy. But again, as long as their privacy and their actions do not violate the integrity of the community or make them ineffective in their careers. Or make them unable to perform their professional duties. So school boards do have the right to dismiss teachers and administrators from their employment positions, and actually even revoke their certifications if their lifestyle choices violate board policy. However, when I was kind of reading through the case studies and just some of the examples, it's really hard. Like there's really no clear distinction between what's protected and what's not protected as far as lifestyle choices go, especially as we kind of jump into the, 2022. What lifestyle choices are acceptable now were definitely not even probably 20 years ago. So the school board really has to just decide if they have enough proof that the lifestyle choice adversely affects the integrity of the district, or that the lifestyle choice will have a lasting negative effect on those relationships with the parents, the students, or other staff members. And if they can show and have proof that that's going to be detrimental to the school and to student achievement, then they can terminate the contract and or even revoke teaching certificates. So what I found was that teachers who are hardworking and have good relationships with parents and students were most likely to be able to remain in their contract. The other thing is kind of like if it was a big thing that blew up and was highly publicized, but maybe not that big of a deal, but a lot of people knew about it. A lot of times just because of the negative publications and the negative publicity, they weren't allowed to, or they just kind of had to terminate the case basically to uphold the integrity of the district. So the two cases that there was three, but the two that I found the most interesting were kind of opposite. So there was a district where one teacher was having an affair with a teacher from another district. I believe both of them were married. So the spouse of the female, this is kind of like a little mini drama, a little soap opera. The spouse of the female tried to have the male removed from his position, stating, unlawful, whatever, like he wasn't upholding the integrity of the district, that kind of thing. And this case actually ended up going to the state Supreme Court and was not upheld. He actually was able to keep his job because his effective teaching and his positive relationships with the students and community were not affected, sorry. But there was another case of infidelity where an administrator was having an affair, and then he ended up blackmailing his mistress's husband with photos to allow the affair to continue. He was dismissed and he did not receive a favorable ruling because he used school time to have the affair, and he used unprofessional and illegal tactics to continue the affair. So my question for you guys is, how can districts be more concrete in their decisions and their decision about what's an acceptable lifestyle choice and what's a not acceptable lifestyle choice? What do you think?
It feels like as long as you don't lose the respect of your class or the parents of your class, once you lose the respect of your class, you're not going to get them to trust you anyway. So your style of teaching or you teaching them won't matter anymore. So at least we move over that school district, maybe not terminate your contract, but I think that'd be the hardest part, is probably once you lose that idea with your students that you probably shouldn't be teaching there anymore.
I think it kind of like talking about both of those cases, it made me think of just like the intention behind both of them. So like the herb case, I think, is the one where he got his job back. And I think that was also the one where he was like, I'm sorry, this was a mistake. I have remorse for it. And it's like the intention behind that is way different than the one where it was like retaliation and blackmailing and things like that. And I know I'm not answering your question because I don't know how a district lays that out, but just like looking at that intention of like one was remorseful, wanted his job, knew it was a mistake, and the other was very vindictive and didn't really respect that.
I think you brought up a good point, Megan, about the intention. And a lot of times I feel like when you think about intention, you also have to think about the impact. Like you may not have intended to hurt somebody, but did it impact, the district or anything like that? So in that herb case, you mentioned his intentions were different than the blackmail one, but it also sounds like that one didn't really impact the kids. Instead, he was turned in by, the person that he was having an affairs with spouse. So I feel like then the impact of the other one is much different when it starts to involve like blackmail and things like that. And then, like you said, Austin, has it damaged the relationships and the integrity of the teacher in the school? I think it's a good point, but that would be hard.
Yeah, I
And
think
just, go ahead, Brandy.
no, I just think it's kind of subjective. I mean, these two are very clearly different. But where is that line, and how do you, again, it's perception data, right? So how do you really know if it affected your relationship with your students and your parents, or are they just being professional and putting on a good face?
Absolutely. And I think like it would be so hard. You really can't outline every possible scenario where right to privacy, you really can't have it that clear cut and dry. It is kind of case by case. And like you said, it's subjective.
Absolutely.
I thought it was interesting how in the herb case they noted, he was such a good teacher, and like, we don't want to lose that. And all the years of good teaching should not just be ruined by this one incident. So I think it's just interesting because it goes back to that subjectiveness of like, yes, but at the same time, like, what if this was a teacher who you didn't have as much respect for, or was newer, or things like that. So
yeah, absolutely. And going back to the idea that teachers are human and they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to have, they have lives outside of their school. So okay, unwed pregnant teachers. So courts tend to vary in rulings regarding unwed pregnant teachers, even though it's 2022. During the early 1960s and 70s, courts were more inclined to rule against single teachers who were dismissed by school boards when they reported their pregnancy, meaning that most teachers lost their jobs if they became pregnant and were not married. Keep going. However, during the mid 70s and early 80s, with increased attention focused on individual rights of teachers, courts became less inclined to rule against unwed pregnant teachers without carefully weighing all aspects of the cases. In doing so, the courts considered the teacher's overall performance record. Again, like we discussed in the past, like what were their effectiveness as a teacher? What were their relationships like? Was this negatively impacting student learning? And what did what was the perception of the other stakeholders about this teacher? And so I'm just kind of wondering, and it doesn't matter now because we've come a long ways, but I'm just thinking like, what were the fathers, if there was an unwed father who was expecting a baby as a teacher, I wonder what that looked like, because it didn't talk about that.
What a great point. Because, and then I think that their rationale would be that it's not visible that the father's having a baby, and they probably would just say you can't talk about it, you can't tell anybody you're expecting. Yeah. Which is sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you're fine. It made me think of, there was a part in the reading where it talked about like societal norms and how like that would kind of determine like the actions that they would take towards teachers. So like, obviously back then the societal norm, like that was not okay. And so it was like harsher punishment. And, but now I think that's obviously a lot more common to have a pregnancy out of wedlock. So it's just interesting that like things can shift with just societal norms, and it's not actually even laws or anything in place. It's just, what's going on in society. And I think that was in like the dress, like teacher dress, where more dress is appropriate as it becomes more appropriate in society. So I just think that's subjective again.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, again, this whole underlying theme, and they even say it multiple times in here, like teachers are just held to a higher standard. Like you are expected to be like the perfect citizen. You're expected to have, higher regard, higher moral grounding. But again, teachers are people, and they make mistakes. And I think to lose to lose one's job, you know, is
Mhm.
just, it's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure for a 25-year-old or a 22-year-old. And so how do you,
Absolutely.
I mean, how do you outline that in a way that's not scary for them?
Mhm.
I feel like this one almost becomes delicate too, in the fact that I think somebody could really argue that marriage is somewhat tied to religion and
Yeah.
may be against, you know, their beliefs. And then just because they don't follow a certain religion that says you need to be married before having kids, does that really prohibit them from having a family? You know what I mean? I think that
Yeah.
really could become a sensitive, I don't know, separation of church and state kind of.
That is a perfect tie-in to the next slide. So great job, great job. Yeah, you can just keep going
Oh,
through that.
sorry, there we go.
Religious freedoms. Obviously, teachers possess religious rights. They can choose to be and celebrate any religion that they want, as long as they remain neutral in their religious preferences at school, much like political preferences. So schools must make reasonable accommodations to support the religion of their employees, like, for example, praying at certain times, attending conferences, that kind of thing. Unless it's completely undoable, it does say reasonable accommodations. And again, going back to those completely subjective, like, what does reasonable mean? Reasonable in every district is going to look different. If I have a bunch of paras that can cover for a teacher while she goes and prays, or he, you know, that's completely different than if we're in a small school and we don't have any paras or any help to cover. So again, that's subjective, reasonable accommodations. Another example that they said allowing a reasonable accommodations was using personal time to be used for religious holidays that weren't observed by the school or by the state, or religious conferences. So there was an example of a teacher in 1986 who was part of a religious organization that required that he be gone from school for six days. However, the school only allowed 3 personal days, and then sick days couldn't be used or carry over. So the teacher actually filed suit, and the court ruled in favor of the teacher, stating that reasonable accommodations need to be made, and suggesting that he just take unpaid leave instead of that sick time or the personal time. Another interesting example, and I know this is one that continues to come up, is Good Friday. So in Chicago, an employee filed suit against a superintendent and board of education and other school officials that designated Good Friday as a school holiday. And then the courts ended up ruling in favor of the teacher, because Good Friday is strictly a Christian event and not a not a cross-secular, cross-religious event. So I thought that was interesting as well. So my question for that was, and I kind of talked about it a little bit, but how does a district define reasonable accommodations? What does that look like? What does that mean?
Yeah, I
As
think
long as
that's
it's not
tough because
disruption.
and when you think about like the times that we get off, like we get off Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving, like the book pointed out, like those all tie back to a religion. And I come from a district that has a large Muslim population, and so we are very, like, we tread very lightly on any holiday work, any you know, when kids have to be gone for their holidays, that's, you know, that's just something that we have to recognize. And so I think it's just bringing that equity to the fact that there's more than just Christianity practice, and what does that look like as far as equity goes.
Awesome. Okay, Family and Medical Leave Act. So this was actually established in 1993, and it allows eligible employees up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave during any 12-month period in an event of a new baby, adoption, caring for an immediate family member with a serious health condition, and medical leave for the employee if they're unable to work. So the employer needs, like, in order to be eligible, the employee must work for a district with more than 50 employees. And this is not just in schools, this is everywhere. And the employee must be employed for a minimum of 12 months or at least 1,250 hours in the previous 12 months. They can elect, or the school can say they have to use all of their paid sick time before they can start, or during that 12 weeks. The employer has to check in on the employee during the leave and question whether or not it's necessary, like the employer can. And the employer can also require further documentation from a doctor, but the employer has to pay for that. So I think, how does a district define a serious health condition? Like what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know that they can get a doctor's note saying that they're eligible for FMLA. But beyond that, you know, what else could a district do to define the serious health condition, or decide when a teacher or an employee could use the FMLA?
I think as long the doctor's note's the main thing there. As far as figuring out if it's like severe or not, and when you can return.
I mean, I
Yeah,
think that goes back to that idea that we talked about, you know, earlier, just there being so many possibilities. I think it's almost impossible for a school to have such a like detailed policy laid out ahead of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think just going back to that, like having that, you know, doctor consultation, recommendation, like what is it, you know, what does prognosis look like, or what does projected needs look like as far as that goes?
I think it gets into a weird situation again, where, you know, teachers are held to a higher standard. There's a funny meme about like a teacher in a hospital bed who's writing sub notes or something, you know, like they're just held to a high, where educators are held to a higher standard. And at which point do you have, when, if you're taking 12 weeks of leave, like when does that start to negatively impact your students' learning, you know? Like, it's kind of scary to think about.
Right. I think that's a good point, Brandy, about, you know, after that extended amount of time, the impact it will have on student learning.
All right, that's it. That's all.
All right. Perfect. Well, thank you guys.